with Heartstopper, what I really liked was, even with that scene, they returned to it in the sense of Charlie opening up about how difficult it is, or even just his friends telling him how that was actually very not okay. And sometimes that's really necessary, right? Because a lot of the times when we're in situations like that, where we're faced with violence, all we want to do is like dissociate and repress it and push it down and not think about it, versus being able to have friends and community around you to tell you, hey, that's actually not okay. Are you okay? Like, what do you need? Can I check in with you about that? And I think they did that really well.
Really excited. You're the second person I've interviewed. Angela was the first. And I guess, like, tell me about why Heartstopper for you. Like, what was the decision behind all of that?
Honestly, ever since it came out and ever since I started watching it, I have always wanted to, I can't stop talking about it really. So I'm really excited to get the chance to talk about it on a podcast. But it's a really like amazing, warm LGBTQ representation kind of show, especially for youth. Because I don't think we get a lot of that. But on the other hand, we also don't get a lot of like, I don't want to say positive. I guess positive in the sense of the feeling, right? Like we get a lot of like really sad and painful representation. And there's there's quite a bit of that here, but it also highlights a lot of like the strength and the resilience, and a lot of things turn out really well for these kids. So it's really heartwarming to watch.
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk to you about that because I was watching an interview with Dan Levy after they asked him about Patrick and David, the dynamic that was happening with the two of them in Schitt's Creek. And he said that as a gay man, this is Dan Levy speaking, he felt like every gay character was either the Joker or the comedian or had like a tragic love story. And I guess like from your lens, I know that you are a non-binary person living on this planet, just trying to navigate what it means to be a human. And as someone that does have a privilege of being heterosexual and doesn't have to navigate these complicated systems.
Yeah, I really like what you said, and bringing up what Dan Levy said, because I definitely feel that myself, watching a lot of like queer film and queer art growing up, just trying to find representations to try to help me make sense of like my identity, my life, my journey. And Heartstopper for me is one of those that really hone in and really do a good job of portraying the difficulties, the struggles, the pains of what that experience is like, but in a strange way also almost, and I've heard this from my clients and a lot of I felt this myself, there's this almost like fantastic sense to it of like, wow, like things are difficult, but it really turns out well. They're so loved and they navigate things so well. Every time, I think the trope with like teen dramas as we're watching it is very much like, you're faced with a really difficult decision. There's like should I do this versus should I do that? And what this show does so well is just showing like, oh, these kids, every time they're faced with such difficult decisions, they choose the good thing, right? Like the well thing to do, right? Whether it's the choice of, should I hide this from my friends or tell them about it? Should I be honest about my feelings? Should I take the high road? Should I go to an adult, right? To talk about how difficult this is. They often always go with what is, as the viewer, kind of like, oh yes, that's the good thing. That's the right thing. That's going to get you like more help and more support. So it's like really, I think that's the heartwarming piece, right? Where it's like, oh my God, I'm really rooting for them and they're really doing so well, even though it's hard.
I'm curious about like which character you resonate with, because obviously there's Charlie, there's Nick, there's Tao, there's all of these different characters. And like, do you feel, because Angela, when I asked her about The Good Place, she said that she feels like she's kind of every character all at the same time. But for you, Jack, like, is there one character that you feel like was you at that age?
Yeah, I think similarly, I can see a lot of different like pieces of the story that fit. I don't think there's ever going to be like a perfect
Mm,
match, but I myself resonate the most with Charlie.
mm,
I think Charlie's story is one that
yeah.
where, people come into awareness with their sexuality and might be able to, even though it's difficult, accept that internally, personally. But when it's being met with the external environment, the outside world, it becomes extremely violent and harmful.
Mm,
And they're bullied, they're shamed, and that gets internalized, and it creates this host of psychological struggles, right? Of shame, of worthiness, of control, and ultimately, you know, suicidal ideation of
mm,
not wanting to be here anymore. And that was a lot of what I went through growing up as a teen. Except, speaking to the fantastic aspect of the show, I did not have the people around Charlie that really showed him that he is worthy of love, that they accept him, that they want to support him and show up for him. So that there's this like bittersweetness in watching a show like this where this is really amazing. Look at how far we've come, but also I, for me, and I assume for many other people who didn't get that experience, like a grief, right? Of, wow, that's something that I really missed out on, right? That I
mm,
never was able to have that connection. And even maybe now for many of my clients who deal with isolation, who identify as LGBTQ, thinking like, wow, like this is something that I can't have or I don't have in my life. That seems so easy, but
yeah.
it's actually in reality so, so, so difficult to come across.
Yeah. I remember the first time I ever interviewed you, you were so open about growing up in Malaysia and how homosexuality was actually a crime. Um, and then you talk about this moment in the car where your sister and your brother in law are driving and you get to the airport and they tell you that your brother is gay. And it's this moment where you feel like it's also okay to share with them, but you didn't at that moment because you weren't ready yet. And I think that your story speaks to so much of why Heartstopper is needed as a story, that there's so many people out there who feel like they can't ever be their full selves.
Mm.
And when you were saying that, Jack, a part of me started getting really emotional, where I've never had to struggle with my sexuality, but I have struggled with feeling different and being bullied. And there's this theme of self acceptance and discovery, particularly in the LGBTQ plus community in this show. And can you speak to like the nuances that they're able to capture in the Netflix series that you feel really seen by? Because I know that media in your teenagehood, I like to say, like played a really big role in that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I'm thinking about is as someone who grew up LGBTQ and didn't have a lot of resources, a lot of what I was hearing and learning about online was coming out,
Mm,
right? That was the big focal point of having this identity was like,
yeah.
when do you come out? How do you come out? Who do you come out to?
Mm,
And I think one thing that Heartstopper does really well is slowing that down or expanding on it, that it's not just, okay, you need to tell someone or you need to be sure, because it takes time, right, to explore that identity.
mm,
Like we see with Charlie's story, where maybe he is pretty clear that he's attracted to Nick,
mm-hmm.
but sorry, Nick is very clear that he's attracted to Charlie,
Yeah.
but it takes him some time to figure out like, what does this mean? Do I have to label myself? What
Mm,
is this label? Do I have to tell people? And they do a really good job of being patient, right? And
mm,
even holding that nuance of contrasting that experience for between Ben, who is someone who is also closeted, but internalizes a lot of queer phobia
yeah.
and replicates that harm by sexually assaulting Charlie, by
Mm-hmm.
keeping him in the shadows and denigrating him, with Nick, who is also undergoing that same process of figuring himself out, but doing it in a way that feels more intentional, doing it in a way that is collaborative with his partner at the time, and all the while understanding that, it does come at a, not at a cost, I want to say, but it does come with difficulties, challenges, being in the closet, having things be kept secret, and it can impact, and it does impact Charlie's mental health based on the experiences that he's had with men before being kept in the closet and being a secret.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many like complex layers, and you're the expert because I only started watching it because of you, Jack. So I just want to say thanks to that. But like, I think that there's something different about the way that Heartstopper talks about sexuality and the little nuances that come with Ben versus Charlie versus Nick. Because I don't know, have you ever watched Glee?
Of course.
Dawson's Creek? So like Dawson's Creek has a gay character, and Glee also has a gay character, but I think that like there's this one scene where like there's a bully, I forget his name, but there's a bully that, do you know who I'm talking
Karofsky.
about? Yeah, Karofsky is bullying.
Is it Kurt?
Kurt, yeah. Karofsky was bullying Kurt, and then like he tries to like kiss him, and I just don't think that Glee scene really explained what was going on. It was kind of like, I think you're closeted, but you're taking out your internalized homophobia onto me. And I think that the scene that you're talking about with Ben sexually assaulting Charlie, I think that Heartstopper actually did do that better justice because it was done from a queer lens as opposed to like a heterosexual lens. Because I think that Glee, as much as they tried, really looked at it from the male gaze, as people like to say, from like a film perspective. But I like that you talk about that, because I think that it's only now in our society that we're beginning to welcome in different voices and different diverse perspectives, would you say?
Yeah. I agree. I think, for what it's worth, I loved Glee growing up. I mean, there was very scant representation, and I don't think there's still very many, even though there's obviously growing representation, which is amazing. But I'm really glad you brought that up, because it is kind of a similar kind of portrayal. And, Glee, I think, doesn't really address it that well, just because there's always so much going on in the show. And it's a drama, right? So it's supposed to. But with Heartstopper, what I really liked was, even with that scene, they returned to it in the sense of Charlie opening up about how difficult it is, or even just his friends telling him how that was actually very not okay. And sometimes that's really necessary, right? Because a lot of the times when we're in situations like that, where we're faced with violence, all we want to do is like dissociate and repress it and push it down and not think about it, versus being able to have friends and community around you to tell you, hey, that's actually not okay. Are you okay? Like, what do you need? Can I check in with you about that? And I think they did that really well. And then I don't know if you've made it to season 2, but they kind of come back to that where, they also show the journey of what Ben goes through, right? And how he tries to apologize or make amends with Charlie, and also maybe a little bit Nick. But they do it really well in the sense of showing how Ben can acknowledge that upon reflection, it is incredibly harmful, what he's done. And being able to give Charlie the space to say, yes, I appreciate this, and no, I don't accept your apology, because what you did was incredibly harmful. That I'm not obligated, or I don't owe you anything to be able to forgive you for doing something that was so violent.
Yeah. And as I also want to acknowledge too, we're two therapists talking about it. And one of the women that I really love to study when it comes to like narcissistic abuse recovery is Dr. Ramani. And she talks about how forgiveness sometimes isn't necessary when it comes to radical violence done on a human being. And I love that you brought up that scene where Ben is trying to reconcile with Charlie. I don't think I've gotten to that part yet, but it kind of reminds me of like we live in this society where everyone wants to forgive. But I think in that statement, sometimes we don't we neglect ourselves when we're in that narrative. And SA is such a serious topic where it's so true that when violence is done to you, all you want to do is dissociate and make it smaller. And to have a friend group like that, to have a support system is really, really necessary for someone not only struggling with their sexuality, but also struggling with violence done to them. Why did that scene stand out so much for you, out of curiosity?
Mm, I think for the reasons that, we've talked about is that it is incredibly nuanced, right? That we're seeing, now we've only been talking about these three characters, Ben, Nick, and Charlie, but we're seeing these characters kind of navigate their sexuality and identity, and it manifests in very different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it really brings in this like empathy, right? Of this is a really hard process for each of them.
Yeah.
Right? And I can understand why it's so hard for Ben. And we can also still sit with what he did was unacceptable. Right? Because a lot of the times there is this difficult dilemma of maybe I should forgive him because I know he's going through something so difficult because I've been through that and I know how difficult it is to be closeted or navigate this identity. But there's this sense of maybe relief in knowing that, hey, I don't necessarily have to empathize with someone who has been violent towards me. Just because our experiences are similar or it's mirrored in certain ways doesn't mean I have to, be loving or kind to them. I think, and I think they do say this where they're like, well, he does deserve love and kindness and community and support, but not from the people that he.
That is such a great way to put like forgiveness and radical acceptance. But let's address the mental health and adolescence piece when it comes to all of this, because I think that empathy toward and empathy to are two of the themes that you're talking about right now, Jack, of the mental health challenges faced by characters, the weight of having to extend understanding, but also understanding that sometimes understanding towards somebody doesn't also mean discrediting what they did to you. If someone is listening to this with a similar situation, going, I should be over this already. Because we hear this as therapists of why am I still going through this? Why is this something that still carries weight? Why can't I just forget about it? What would you say to that person listening to this right now? Big question I just asked you, so take your time.
I think these kinds of experiences, and what I mean is sexual assault, sexual violence, and to a larger extent, any experiences that are traumatic or incredibly harmful, it creates a sense of psychological unsafety that is incredibly difficult to undo. I think we underestimate the impact that these experiences have, that these aren't just, okay, so this person does this to you, get over it. It also extends to what is the world that I'm living in that this could happen to me? What is my relationship with other people going to be knowing that this happened with this person? Can I trust someone else? Can I open myself to another relationship knowing that this was what happened?
Yeah. And I think the nuanced piece to all of this too is when violence is done to you, oftentimes victims blame themselves and their own sense of judgment of how can I trust myself? Whether it was their fault or not. There's also a lot of victim blaming that can often go into the psychology of someone going through SA, that I think it requires patience and boundaries with yourself of what can or can't I handle right now. I kind of want to dig into this, and if you don't want to talk about it, it's okay. But you speak very openly about your personal struggles with suicidality, working at a suicide hotline, and then being able to grapple with that openly with other people. I guess, like, can you speak to some of the mental health issues you've seen in Heartstopper and whether or not it's helped you heal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I know you sent over the draft, and one of the questions was around how would therapists kind of address, what they're going through. And I thought about this a lot, right? Where therapy is a space where so much can be so different for each person, right? Where even though, even here, right, we're talking about Nick, Charlie, and Ben going through similar experiences of navigating identity, therapy for each of them would be incredibly different. So I'm thinking about therapy for Nick, where, he doesn't have a lot of understanding friends, right? He's in a space where he is pretty comfortable with his attraction, but he doesn't know how to label it. And he's contending with coming to terms with it, meaning that his social life might be drastically different. So therapy could look like a non-judgmental space for him to talk about these things, what feelings it brings up. And it's important for him because there's a strong heteronormative pressure where it can be much more difficult to feel like you can even talk about or even think about like straying from the expectations of dating a girl, which is kind of what we saw a little bit when he began dating like Imogen, or he was like pressured to talk to Tara. To your question about like my own therapy, or I guess what it would be like, what it's been most helpful to see in Heartstopper is, I would say, mirroring therapy for Charlie, which is that these experiences that happened, one, I think the point that you brought up of learning not to personalize them, right? That it's not your fault that these things are happening, being able to contextualize that the world can be incredibly violent and is still very queerphobic.
Yeah.
And a lot of things that go on because of that is not your fault for being queer. And the other thing I'm thinking about, believing that you are worthy of love and worthy of living, right? Because I think Charlie, especially in season 2, kind of struggles a lot of believing that someone could really love him, right? And that was exacerbated by his experiences with Ben, where he had to keep the relationship under wraps. And then maybe a little bit with Nick too. And they talk about that, right? Even though Nick is a lot more understanding and accepting and doesn't do all the things that Ben used to do, he's still figuring things out and therefore had to keep the relationship under wraps.
Yeah.
And that kind of feels some type of way for Charlie. So one scene that was incredibly powerful was, the finale of season 2 for me, where Charlie finally opens up about how he feels, right? About how difficult this experience has been of being bullied, of struggling with the trauma of what he's gone through, and feeling sometimes that he self-harms, and feeling sometimes that he doesn't want to live because of how painful it is. And being able to have said that to someone and have your partner not try to fix it, not try to tell him that there was something wrong with him, but just tell him that it makes sense and I'm here for you. I want to support you. You can talk to me about these things. I don't want you to feel like you're going through this, because that was really hard. I think that's why it's so beautiful to see, again, a little bit of that fantastic kind of sense to it. It's like responding to something so painful, so delicately and so well, without jumping into, you need help, or you need to tell someone else, you need to go to a therapist. Right? That can come after, of course, but what was most important in that moment was looking for understanding and connection. And Nick was able to do that for him.
Yeah. Just the way that you put that, Jack, it's just in a world where all you know is rejection, and where media is always trying to put you down, and they're in a world full of violence and queer phobia. I'm understanding what you mean by phantasmic a little bit, because it's showing you or giving you an example of what healthy queer relationship could look like. And it's so rare now I think it's always been rare. I'm correcting myself. Like, to have someone look at you and to go, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Like, you're welcome here. We don't have to fix it. We don't have to break anything. I'm just going to be here with you. I guess what emotions came up for you, and what impact did that scene have for you?
I think I was feeling everything, really. I named a little bit of grief, right? And grief is an experience that encapsulates a lot of different feelings. I think I felt incredibly seen. This was something that, I had struggled with too. And to be able to see that, wow, this is okay. Right? First, to portray on screen. And secondly, to see that even then they were able to reconcile and stay together and figure things out together was beautiful. I think one thing I'm thinking about is it is incredibly rare to see, as you said, like healthy queer relationships. A lot of the times for many queer adults, the teenage years were filled with a lot of shame, a lot of I am different, therefore I'm wrong or broken. And what you even said, like, thank you for sharing, your welcome here, is so powerful just because there is such strong feelings of something's wrong with me. And something about this show that made me feel this sense of grief and made me feel this deep sense of sadness was that I personally, and I know a lot of other adults too, never got to experience that kind of love, right? In adolescence, that we never got to experience this innocence or unadulterated love that wasn't kind of influenced. I think it's very different to be dating in your teen years versus for most people in your 20s or even 30s, right? We contend with adult issues like jobs, living situations, futures. We rarely meet people organically, like in a school setting.
That's so true.
Right? Most of us in our 20s start dating because of dating apps.
Yeah.
And, that comes with so much more, unfortunately, unhealthier things that live on there.
What unhealthy things for you, out of curiosity?
Oh my gosh. Well, for me, when I first started dating, I first started dating in Malaysia when I was 18. And the only way I knew how, because it was, nobody was really, not many people, I should say, are very openly out. So it was on Grindr, on a dating app where nobody had put on their faces because nobody wanted to be outed. Because we were still incredibly homophobic. So my first experiences with dating was literally opening an app for most adults to hook up, right? And faced with photos of like torsos, unsolicited, like naked pictures and nudes, thinking that sometimes, you're starting to have a conversation with someone and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, so you want to like hook up? Right? And that's kind of carried through my 20s, right? Like that there'd never been a time where things felt like, oh, I'm dating someone who's very understanding about where I'm going through, how I'm navigating things, how hard it is to kind of find this like space where I feel comfortable or even friendship.
Yeah.
Right? Because so much of the pressure was around like sex and relationships. So yeah, I think about that a lot when I think of grief. Is many adults and queer adults don't necessarily have that experience of being able to just date as simply as our heterosexual counterparts growing up. And Heartstopper is one of those things where you see that and you're like, oh my God, wow, like this is, it must be nice,
Yeah, it's kind of living in an alternate universe where dating doesn't have to be violent and it doesn't have to be non-consensual, because the way that you talk about your early dating life when you're 18 and it's your first time dating, the first thing you don't think about is sex. The first thing you think about is, will this person like me?
Yeah.
Will I develop butterflies? Will I develop an emotional connection with them? And so to be bombarded by pictures like that, I can imagine how overwhelming that must have been for you as an 18-year-old in Malaysia. I kind of wanted to ask you this, Jack, because when I was going through the outline and I was thinking about you, I started analyzing the characters, and Tao is one of the few Asian characters in the show. And I wanted to ask you, if you were to criticize the show, do you think that intersectionality is one of the missing parts for Heartstopper? Because Charlie is not, like, a person of color.
Mhm. No, I hear that. And I think that's something that's very, very apt, right?
Mm.
That, of course, with any show, that we want to make sure that there's representation.
Mm.
And one of the things I think about is that maybe there are some subtle representations. One thing I'm glad for is that there is racial diversity, right,
Right.
in the cast, even though maybe they don't speak very much about race and racism openly in the show.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily fault the show for that. I think it does the best it can, right? So, for example, they do change Ellen Tara's hairstyles a lot, which, is kind of a nod to the nuances of Black girls and their hair.
Mm.
And I think there's also scenes where, Tao's mom comes in speaking in Cantonese,
Yeah.
and she brings like cut fruit, which is a very,
Very Asian
Asian
thing.
stereotype. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's like subtle things. But
Yeah.
I think ultimately, the show's creator, Alice Oseman herself, is white,
Mm.
right? And I don't I don't criticize her for not being able to fit in more complex intersectional stories in terms of race. She's already brought representation for trans folks, bisexual folks, and even an asexual character into, you know, 2 8-episode seasons of this TV show so far. So it's just 16 episodes, which I think is incredible.
Yeah.
With what she's given. I hope that people see this more as an invitation, right, to platform more stories or shows that bring more nuances and representations, maybe with queer, disabled, different multiracial folks on screen.
Mm. Yeah, because one of the key points I wanted to talk to you about is this question of intersectionality, because I think that, when it comes to TV and media, there are so many pigeonholes that we kind of put people in, of this person is queer, this person is disabled, this person is Asian, or this person is a person of color. And I think people are more complicated than we peg them to be. And there's this quote that I kind of wanted to explore with you, if you're willing to. I heard it from a mentor who told me once that reality is stranger than fiction. And I would love to hear your perspective on that.
I like that. I think one of the things I think about is we all want to be seen, right? We all want to be understood. And I think that's why representation is so important.
Yeah.
And I think that's why representation also comes under criticism a lot.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're passionate about wanting to see our stories represented on screen.
Yeah.
And it's also important, as you said, to acknowledge that it's difficult to represent all facets of someone's identity. And I think a lot about like my identities, almost like, I don't remember where I've heard this before, but almost like a turntable, right? In certain spaces, certain shows, certain things, it's tuned up a little bit. In other spaces, let's say for this example, I'm thinking a lot more about my queer identity, my non-binary identity versus my Asian immigrant identity. And that could be very different when I'm watching a show like, Fresh Off the Boat. Yeah. But one of the things that, I think about is for many, many years, especially in Hollywood, the representations, even though there's been diverse stories, the people who inhabit these stories have been pretty similar. Right? So a lot of white, middle class, cisgender, heterosexual folks.
Yeah.
And that's not to say there's not diversity in that group, which there is, but we've seen a lot of that. To simply reduce Heartstopper down to a queer story does it a disservice. But it's also important to label it as such because it is an important part of expanding what the queer experience could be. And I think these kinds of shows, when they're a little bit like trailblazing in a sense, garners sometimes an unfair or more criticism than others because we expect so much from them. And it's important to remember that one show will not do it all.
Yeah. That's actually incredibly, I want to say, heartwarming for me, because I think that was one of my criticisms going into it, But you, Jack, being able to go into it with a compassionate lens of, take perspective in the fact that the show is already different in comparison to a lot of the media portrayals that are happening right now on Netflix or on HBO Max or on Disney, where it's trickled in or sprinkled in here and there, but it's never really explored as a theme. So that's really helpful, I think. What do you think therapists should encourage clients to keep discussing in the therapy room? What I mean by that is, like you kind of touched on it earlier, where there are considerations that therapists usually go into when they're analyzing a client. We go into sexuality, gender identity, cultural background. But we often get questions like these from clients of, I never really felt represented in the therapy space. And so for someone that might be interested in going to therapy for the first time, what are some considerations they should be looking for when it comes to an inclusive therapist?
This is on the client side.
On the client side. And even on the therapist side too, maybe you can tackle it from both sides of the chair, if you will. Yeah.
I love that, both sides of the chair.
Yeah.
I'll start with the client side. I think from the client side, it is difficult, being someone who is in therapy and has been in therapy with many different therapists, is that, yes, there is this difficulty, right? That I want to see a therapist that understands or resonates with my experience, so I don't have to explain myself as much. So, I'm trying to look for a queer, potentially trans, non-binary, person of color therapist, but those are very limited and often have a waiting list because other people are thinking in the same way.
Yeah.
So, if you are able to do that, great. But on the other hand, a lot of my therapists have also been people who don't share many of my identities. I had a therapist, my first therapist that I really resonated with and opened up with and saw for a longer period of time, because I used to drop out like after 1 or 2 sessions. I was not a good client. I will say that.
Same. It took me, so I had 4 different therapists, and the first 3 I dropped out after 2 sessions.
It's real, and we need to talk about that. I'm glad we're bringing this up.
But what resonated, I don't know what your experience was for your therapist, but for me, my therapist was white and she was older, and she was willing to say that to me. She said, I know that I come across as someone that has a lot of privilege and identity, and I want to acknowledge that. But if it's any consolation, my children are biracial. I'm married to an Indian man. And so I've noticed that my children are treated in a different way compared to how they treat me. And so if you're willing to acknowledge the identity and racial differences here and the cultural differences, I'd be open to that. And that's what kept me working with her. And I worked with her for 6 years after that. So,
wow.
Yeah. Only recently we terminated last fall because I didn't need therapy services anymore. But yeah, for now, at least.
Well, congrats on that.
Thanks, Jack. What kept you with the therapist you worked for a long time?
Well, when I first started out, I never really like selected my therapist because I didn't know much about it.
Yeah.
Right. Like I didn't really, I just thought, oh, therapy is therapy is therapy. So pick one that has availability and go into it. But what kept me in that first one was that was the first Asian person actually I've seen in be a therapist.
Wow.
He was a cisgender heterosexual man, from what I can tell. He never really opened, he never really talked about his life. And part of me was very at first very hesitant or wary about that, because from the environment that I grew up in, of course, it was all Asian folks, but particularly Asian men who were very critical of my femininity or of my queerness. And I really had a lot of fear of specifically Asian masculinity. So I think it was kind of a good match at the right time, where here was an Asian man who was showing me compassion, understanding, willing to listen. So even though there was that initial fear and resistance of oh, feels so uncomfortable because of what I've gone through. It also, I could also recognize, oh, but I think this is exactly what I need.
So reparative. I want to go into like self-expression and authenticity. And before I go into those questions, I just want to say that in the time I've gotten to know you, I've noticed that your self-expression when it comes to being and embodying all that you are has stayed pretty consistent, but I noticed that there's a part of Jack, and the reason why I'm saying this to people listening is because I've known Jack now for about a year and a half. And since we've been working together, I've noticed that you've been joking a lot more. You've been dressing the way that you want to dress. You've been wearing lip gloss. You've been smiling. And I know that the journey that you've faced has been filled with fear. And I don't know, this is the judgment I'm making, but it seems like you're in a place where you're healthier and you feel like you can be yourself. And some people don't always have the ability to do that. And, you know, in Heartstopper, we explore their own journeys with expressing themselves and accepting their sexuality. But what lessons have you, Jack, drawn from your life when it comes to self-expression and authenticity? Did it require the level of patience that Charlie's friends showed him? What sort of support did you need in order to get here? And if my analysis is incorrect, let me know.
No, I think I love that. First of all, thank you for the observation.
Yeah.
It's always nice to hear from an external perspective. But, you know, I think one of the things, and this kind of speaks a little bit to your earlier question of like speaking from the therapist side of things, is I have had really good support in my life. I've been able to, not just as a therapist, but being in therapy, bolster that sense of, oh, you know, like I live this life for me, right? And I deserve to have love and care in my life. Heartstopper and other art is definitely one piece of that journey of being able to see that, wow, this is actually what we deserve. Because sometimes that can be the hardest piece of feeling like, well, it's so rare to have a life where your family accepts you, your friends accept you, you can be authentic, expressing who you are and be okay.
Yeah.
A lot of the times we feel like we have to negotiate certain parts of our identity, and being able to have that kind of support and have this kind of representation, I think feeds into what I think is maybe the most important thing I've learned about being in therapy and being a therapist for a lot of LGBTQ people is fostering the imagination. A lot of times, you know, when we face the barriers to connection that I've seen in my clients and myself, it leaves us feeling a lot of shame around our identities, a lot of isolation, loneliness, and hopelessness. And I think the imagination is what we need to instill hopefulness, right? To be able to hold that what we go through, what our experiences have been of marginalization, oppression, and violence is unfortunately still very real and very painful, but also able to figure out how to access a life that's worth living for. To me, that's the goal of therapy, to not to be happy or healed or like all my problems are solved, but to be able to see life as it is and still say, hey, you know, I think there's still things I enjoy and I want to do with this life. There's still people or places or things I care about. There's still ways that I can make a difference. So I can hold on to that.
Let's close with this last question because I want to make sure that I respect your time, Jack. But you talk about imagination and how cultivating a sense of imagination is really, really important for people that might struggle to express themselves or hold authenticity. What do you imagine your future to look like 5 years from now? Like what does Jack look like in their early 30s?
You know, that is a really tough question because I never imagined I would live past my mid-20s, to be honest.
Really? Thank you for being honest.
I mean, I'm now 28.
Mm.
I never imagined living past 27, but now that I'm here, I can't say I have a specific visual of what my life is going to be in 5 years. I think maybe that's part of my journey still currently. But I will say that when I think about today, when I think about next week, when I think about next year, I can confidently say life is really difficult. I know maybe things are going to come up that are going to be hard again, but I feel good and I trust myself and I love myself enough, understand that I will get me through this, that because of the support that I've built around me, because of the way that I've been able to live, the way that I've continued to grow, that regardless of what happens next year, in 5 years, that I will be able to find a way to get to or live in the way that I want to live as best I can in terms of what is in my control.
Yeah. So this is what I hear you saying of, I never thought I would live past 27. I'm 28 now, but I know that I can get myself this, if I could get myself this far, I can make it through a lot of things. Yeah.
One thing that I remember one of my queer Asian elders saying at a conference once was, was telling us younger Asian queers, like, y'all are living genders, identities, sexualities that I couldn't even imagine. I think that really stuck with me because it is really hard, right? To live in a world in many ways, make it incredibly hard for us to envision a life worth living or what our life is going to look like, right? Because there's no marriage. Maybe there's kids, but that's still pretty new.
Yeah.
Owning a home together, starting a family, none of that was built in for us in a sense.
Right.
And so the more that we're able to, I think, imagine and the more that we're able to live in the way that we do, simply just by living in the way that we do, we create a lot more possibilities for each other and especially for like future generations. Because they can then point to this person like, hey, they lived as an out and queer person and they seem to be doing pretty well.
Yeah. Jack, I just want to acknowledge the vulnerability and the way that you challenged me gently today. You probably don't feel like you did, but in a lot of ways, I think I came into this with so much, I think, curiosity and dubiousness about what Heartstopper was even about. And so your honesty and going, no, this is actually so meaningful to me. And by me, I mean you, Jack, because this was the childhood I think I never really received. This was the dating experience I never received. So it was very reparative and grief oriented for me. And I think even the way you talk about your future, I feel really humbled that you opened up about that in a public forum, because as someone who does carry a lot of privilege in her own like sexuality and gender identity, it's easy for me to think about 5 years from now, about having a family, getting married, etc. But I'm just so grateful for your candidness of, the world wasn't built for people like us. And like for me, I think being able to just make it through another day and knowing that I can do that is far more important than imagining myself 5 years from now. And so that's really humbling. And I'm just really grateful that you were open enough with us, the podcast audience, about your story.
Thank you. Yeah. I hope this helps with the listeners and wherever this goes. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak about Heartstopper.
Thanks, Jack. And thank you for speaking about yourself. This was so good. Made it to the end of the episode. I think you deserve a thank you. Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, wouldn't be anything without followers like you. I promise you that the production of these podcasts will continue to increase as the listeners increase and the followers increase. And so if you can do me a favor, if you found any value from this podcast episode, please give this a like, share, or subscribe to the show. It really helps us out. It keeps the word going and it helps our impressions. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Friday.